Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Pegasus Files. It's Andrew McGuigan here with Acart Communications. Very privileged to have and very excited to have Nick Nanos on the show today. Nick is the Chief Data Scientist with Nanos Research. Welcome to the show, Nick.
It's great to join you, Andrew.
So, Nick, it would be great to sort of just jump into a bit of a history on Nanos Research and sort of have you sort of educate some of the viewers and listeners on the business.
Yes. So how about this? A 30-year overnight success. You know, we started the firm over 30 years ago, and just organically grew. We started in the small town of Kingston, great town to kind of be in that market, and basically moved up the food chain. You know, our first big break as a company was to pick up a really small retail client that had about 17 stores in Canada at the time. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. They're called Staples. Yeah, seriously. I got a call from the local Staples store, and they asked us to do a survey. And from that one survey, we did 17 surveys, and our company grew with Staples from like 17 stores to 225 stores. So very steeped in the retail industry. But you know, from Staples, we basically built a great client base that includes kind of retail, professional associations, governments, you know, telecommunications companies. And basically the common element is that we are about data, big data, little data, crunching data, using artificial intelligence to kind of glean insights and to provide data-driven advice to our clients to help them navigate in a pretty complicated and very changing world.
That's a great explanation, Nick. So maybe just before we dive into some of the other topics that we're going to chat about today, the role of a chief data scientist. So essentially, for people that are unaware, your role is, you know, you administer large and small scale sort of surveys and different serums for gathering data. And, you know, it could be interviews, it could be a wide variety of different systems that you use and AI as well. And then you provide strategic insights based on that to help businesses sort of make decisions. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, actually, and you know, this also includes most clients have a lot of data, and this data is underutilized. So in addition to us doing original research, many times clients have data sets, and we kind of go, hey, this is gold. There's a lot here. You can data mine your own stuff. We can help you do that. And one of the other things that we've been increasingly asked to do is to help companies and organizations build data intelligence capability internally, where we're training people inside the organization and then setting up systems on monitoring data and stuff like that, where organizations can do that internally as opposed to hiring consultants all the time, every time they want to kind of crunch their own numbers.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So COVID-19, I mean, obviously it'd be good to just get some understanding from the data, what you can sort of, share some insights on. But what are some of the consumer habits that you're seeing that maybe if you can talk about pre-COVID and talk about COVID, like how are you seeing some of the global pandemic play into some of those consumer habits?
Well, you have to see, from a research perspective, what we're seeing in terms of impact, 3 big impacts. One related to health and physical health, one related to psychology and mental health, and the other one related to economic health. And for anyone that has a customer, that's basically the 3 ways that they should be unpacking that customer. So, what we do know from our polling is that there's a significant amount of anxiety related to people's personal health, whether they get COVID-19 or whether a loved one gets that. And they are changing their physical behavior accordingly so that they don't get it. This gets into everything from social distancing to going to wearing masks, to wearing gloves and stuff like that. And then there's kind of the psychology and the fear and anxiety that people have. We have people that, according to our survey, they're more stressed, they're more worried, they're having greater difficulty sleeping. So you have to think of, if you kind of unpack people and customers, so they're worried about their health and they are crankier than they usually are because of the pressure and stress that they're under. And then you have the money, where you have that economic anxiety where people are wondering when they'll be back to work. They're wondering whether their job will be there when they get back to work. They're wondering when they get back to work whether that job will be changed. So you have to think of your customer as having almost like a toxic cocktail of emotional, physical, and financial stress that they're under, and how they're changing their habits and what they're looking for as a result.
Yeah, that makes sense. So when you look at some of the verticals that you're seeing and through some of the data that you've got, what are some of the verticals that you're seeing that are most, under the most exposure right now, or, in most risk?
Yeah, well, we do a lot of work in the hotel industry, right? Hotel hospitality industry. And if you think at one end of the spectrum, when you think of verticals, maybe a new way to think about verticals is how dependent are you on the face-to-face in-person interaction versus an online interaction. Hotels is a prime example. Hotels are basically selling an experience, a place, something that you do in person, and it's hard for them to port that value proposition into an online environment. And then you go to the other end of the spectrum, and some of these verticals are actually quite adaptable, right? And the ideal vertical, maybe here's a tip, I don't know if anybody can do this. The ideal vertical is to get the government to say that you are an essential service, right? Because that means that you basically have a license to stay open, assuming that you kind of respect what I'll say certain health rules, but that you are less vulnerable if you happen to be defined as an essential service compared to those that are non-essential. And then in the middle are the verticals that are getting squeezed. And why don't we use retail as the example, where they need that bricks and mortars element. Many of them are very dependent on bricks and mortar, and online is the other part of that hybrid equation. And what we're seeing at least is for those verticals that are in that hybrid space, the online experience is being accelerated because customers still want to connect to the retailers that they love. Although they might not be able to go to see the retailer in person, they still want to get those services and get those products, and they're reaching out to do that online.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the one thing that I've also read online and seen a lot of is the trickle down effect. So you've got air travel and you've got entertainment, you've got all of these sorts of industries that really relied on human interaction, and now those industries are being shaken up, and they're having to think about how are they going to remain relevant. That's a word that we use a lot at the moment, relevancy. How are they going to operate in one of the other guests on the show had coined the term the not new normal. So how do you remain relevant in that sort of environment? But yeah, I think you're seeing it's pretty devastating what you're seeing in terms of the trickle down effects from all of these industries that they really had a meshed sort of environment to work together, and it worked before, but you remove that human interaction and that physical being able to do business in the places where they are, and it becomes challenging, I think. I guess so. Even just talk about like businesses. Many businesses you've got that are working from home, staff are working from home. I guess a question that I have for you, is there any data, or can you point to, or you sort of glean any insights from, how do you think things are going to look if this remains the same way for an elongated period of time? Do you see more changes to the consumer buying process or consumer habits, or do you think that things are going to relatively remain the same?
No, it's not going to remain the same. It's going to be a bit of a revolution and a restructuring of the consumer marketplace, and it's going to be a long haul. This is, I think this is going to be like the Depression. It's going to change and scar a generation, where if you remember back in the Depression, they went from, was it the Roaring 20s, right, where everybody's partying, making money off the stock market, drinking champagne out of fancy shoes. And from that to, a depression, an embracement of frugality, less ostentation, less of a consumer society, and kind of a re-examination of what's important. And we're seeing that now. And the interesting twist this go is this whole concept of social self-isolation, where when the Depression occurred in the 1930s, there was no isolation there because families were still together, people interacted with their neighbors, they were able to share experiences and get through it together. Fast forward now, and what we're seeing is people having binary relationships basically online and not connecting socially the same way they did in the past. And once you start to break those patterns of the past, what we basically get is a new pattern. So if I can just use an example, if you start to buy spices online through an online retailer, you might go, well, maybe I don't need to buy spices at the grocery store anymore. I'm just going to stop doing that because this seemed to be okay. So it's going to be hard to turn back the clock, and that's why it's going to be critical for retailers and businesses to be agile and to figure out ways to keep the relationship and those contacts with their customers in order to get through this.
Yeah, I mean, just on the retail side again, obviously we've seen that retail's been really exposed. Even in a lot of the big box stores were already, department stores are already facing some of these challenges, pre-pandemic. Do you think that there's going to be a more of an experiential, like sort of omni-channel experience where online is really just going to be this massive driving force, and the secondary market will be physical brick and mortar? Or do you think, people will really yearn for that physical contact with to be able to try something on and experience it?
Yeah.
What are your general thoughts there?
Yeah, Andrew, you're going to hate this answer. Depends. How's that?
Yeah.
I think the reality is that for most verticals it will continue to be a combination of both online and in person. But the thing is that what happens in person will be very different than what happens online. So if you're in the clothing industry, you're still going to want to try something on. You're still going to need a place to go do exchanges, maybe a place to get extra customer service. But you're going to be able to engage in much of that relationship online, but you're still going to want to have some sort of bricks and mortar, and that's probably going to be the big learning, and the big outcome of this is a recalibration between online shopping and in-person shopping, a recalibration between telework and working physically in an office. And those are the recalibrations that we're going to see that are going to fundamentally change the business structure of many companies.
It's interesting. I just saw today actually a Canadian company, I think they're called Indochino. They're a suit company, Canadian retailer. And now they've just launched virtual sales meetings with customers. They're a custom suit store, and they're doing virtual. You book your virtual meeting with one of their customer attendants, and they'll go through all your sizing and everything like that through these virtual calls. I just found that fascinating. That what was really a traditional retailer in a setting is moving toward that model. And I think we're also seeing some of the big brands, I think it was Twitter that came out and said that all their staff now are going to work from home. They're not going to have them come back into the office after the pandemic passes. I mean, those are big companies that traditionally, I think, maybe had more people working in office. I'm curious to know, do you think that, obviously many brands never even imagined working remotely. A lot of their systems and architecture maybe weren't even designed for it. Do you think that there's going to be, do you think that people will want to come back and be in the physical office space? Or do you think people will enjoy working from home, and this has sort of set them down a new path?
I think what we're going to see is the office space not only is going to physically change, but it's going to downsize. Another example is OpenText. OpenText, a global player in data intelligence, announced they're going to be downsizing 20% of their offices around the world, and that their team will just continue to telework and work remote. And that's going to be, that's going to be the next wave of change, as companies that have managed to operate remotely will kind of reevaluate. So do we need 5,000 square feet of office in a city? Can we get by with 4,000 square feet? And if we have that 4,000 square feet, how do we recalibrate that experience? So the same thing that I talked about retail, a recalibration of that online and in-person experience is going to happen for work. And think of it this way, Andrew. Our retail model is largely built on people working and living kind of like the downtown mall, like in Ottawa, the Rideau Centre, which is downtown. Well, what's the viability of the Rideau Centre if 20% of the downtown that was working downtown 4 months ago is going to be working from home, and that there are few people downtown? And this is what I mean by kind of this fundamental restructuring that we're going to get.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, and I mean, obviously it's a personal opinion, but for me, like the one thing that I've missed the most during the pandemic has been physical interaction with people, collaboration in person, and before, I think there are a lot of people that maybe conceptually thought it would be fun to work from home. It would be fun to have that flexibility, but it's kind of like the grass is always greener on the other side. I think a lot of people are finding, you've got kids at home, you've got not an ergonomic workspace, you're challenged and it's different, and maybe, I don't know, maybe productivity is not as good as it could be if you're in a traditional office setting. I'm curious to see what brands do out of this. I know from my own personal perspective, I miss that physical interaction with people, and I think I'll spend less time on my phone, for example, out of this than I was on it pre-pandemic, because I've been forced to be glued to virtual teleconferencing software for 10 hours a day. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting conundrum that we're in right now.
Yeah, well, think of it this way. The big question that people will be asking on a go-forward basis is our business model pandemic proof? Is our relationship with our clients pandemic proof? Is the way our teams operate pandemic proof? And let's talk about universities. Think of universities. They're kind of re-examining their model of delivering education in terms of online education. They're trying to figure out a path. The thing is that the universities could realistically, once the pandemic's over, start sending people back. But what happens if there's a recurrence? And that's why the businesses have to do a kind of some fundamental soul searching with themselves and their customers in terms of finding a path that can balance both keeping that connection, but that if it's stressed or stresses are put on it because of another pandemic, that they can ride out a second wave or a third wave or a fourth wave over the next who knows how many years.
I saw a post on LinkedIn probably about a week ago, and somebody had sort of commented saying that anybody who says that they had a pandemic plan is not being truthful there, because no one's ever seen anything like this. But I've spoke to some business leaders that had robust plans in place, and I find it interesting, I think this sort of pandemic is quite unique in nature versus others that we've seen in the past. But I think it will cause businesses and people in general to think more closely about, are we prepared if something goes wrong? Do we have the rainy day fund, for example? Do we have some liquidity? And maybe that becomes something that's more important to people. I'm curious to know if you have any data sort of talking about job security. Are most people really nervous about what's going to happen? And is that a short-term feeling, or do you think it's a longer-term sort of feeling?
Yeah. So we track every week consumer sentiment for Bloomberg News, and we track 4 dimensions: job security, people's personal finances, the value of homes in their neighborhood, and also the forward view. And what we've seen is a massive slump in consumer confidence in the last 8 weeks. It's now starting to plateau, but we're realistically in kind of depression territory. People's job security is a little less firm, but what we do know is that people are 6 times more likely to think that the economy will be weaker than stronger in the next in the next 6 months. That people also, a vast majority of Canadians, I think over 6 out of every 10, think that there will be more aid required from the government to businesses and individuals, that this is just the first round because of how people expect things to be really tough in the second half of 2020, and right now I think it's kind of funny. If I was to distill 30 years of listening to customers, they'd say stuff like, "Don't mess things up." Like if someone is a customer for a business, they want to keep that relationship, and they don't want that business to do anything to mess up the relationship. And right now we're in a period of change, and as a result, it just creates a lot of anxiety for a lot of people right now.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess, Nick, let's talk about the advertising side. I'm really curious to get your perspective here. So sort of going through this, consumer habits of changing, their buying processes changing. Like, how do you think sort of advertisers are going to have to go at sort of reaching people moving forward? I mean, there is this delicacy of, what sort of messaging do we use and how do we communicate? Should we have just kept doing what we were doing before? I mean, an example I can give you is that I was speaking with a strategist on the show, and there was a couple of examples of businesses that just kept giving the same email marketing as usual, as if their shops, nothing changed. They were just using the same messaging. Uh, Others I was getting email spam from movie theater companies, that were still sort of going about things in a very, similar way. So how do you think advertisers are going to have to sort of adapt through this? And do you think, there's going to have to be structural changes to the way they go about doing things?
I think it's going to, well, first of all, it's going to accelerate things in terms of online, but actually more important is going to be the message mix. 2 words, Andrew, 2 words. We understand. Advertisers have to convey in the messages that they're going to be putting out in the public domain a message that companies understand how their customers feel, and that they are adapting and adjusting to that, and that they are agile. And I think think of it this way: in a world where about 90% of Canadians in surveys that we've done out there say that they're spending more time at home and that they're self-isolating as a result. So you have to think of how companies can communicate so that customers can empathize with them, and that customers can connect with them because of the social isolation that's there. And I think pretending that this is a pre-COVID world is like you could deny it, but people are it's gonna lack a certain authenticity. So I think people want to know what you can do with them, how the relationship can continue, what is the extra value that can be delivered, and how are you how are organizations coping with that, and how are they delivering value to customers?
Yeah. A question just on air travel, and that's one that I'm very curious about, and I don't know if you have any data that can talk about that, but is there any sentiment or data sort of surrounding, consumers, would they be willing to sort of fly again, even if there's not a vaccine? Like, do you think people will hesitate in general to travel? Do you have any sort of data around that, or any comments or thoughts around that?
We don't have any data because right now nobody's traveling, and that many of the airlines have shut themselves down voluntarily. But what we do know from the research that we've done in this sector is you have to think of, there's a small minority of customers that are air travelers that represent the bulk of travel, and these are business travelers that have to travel. And then there's numerically the majority that are kind of tourists, right? They only periodically air travel. I think I think for both of those segments, the high value air traveler and what I'll say the vacation traveler, both of those segments will be negatively impacted because there'll be someone that say, do you need to go in person? And we've learned over the last 8 weeks that a lot of business can still be conducted without being there in person. So they'll need that justification. But I think the reality is what I expect on the other end of this is that for those high value business customers, they're still going to be traveling. although they're going to be looking for a platform where they're traveling with carriers that provide safety, right? Security, comfort, and are agile enough to kind of adapt to make sure that that experience is positive for those high-value business travelers.
Yeah. So, I guess based on, I asked this to another gentleman that was on the show. There's a lot of people that are talking about this being a V recovery and the post-pandemic being right around the corner. There's some people that are saying it's, a W or an N, or, I'm just out of curiosity. What are your general thoughts? Is it going to be, do you think we're through the thick of this? Do you think it's going to be a quick upswing, or do you think it's long and slow?
Okay, so first of all, the stock market is not reality because,
Yeah.
it's basically completely disconnected from the real economy. But when we're looking at the real economy, which has to do with people's jobs, I would say that we're looking at a U-shaped recovery with a big flat U in the middle. I would expect that it will take at least 5 years to recover in terms of job losses, and probably 10 years, I would expect for a full recovery where we're back to times where the economy feels robust. And through that 5 to 10 year period, other potential shocks, if there's another outbreak of the pandemic or something else that happens that could create even greater level of uncertainty. So I don't believe the V will be the stock market drop. And actually, why don't we say the stock market is going to be like a W? There'll be a shock. We've had the first shock and it recovered. There'll be another shock as very negative GDP numbers and unemployment numbers go down, and the stock market will recover, and it'll be an up and down W. But for the bulk of the majority of Canadians, this is going to be a long, tough slog that is going to be a big U from my perspective.
Yeah. So I guess maybe can we talk about leadership a little bit? Like we've seen through the pandemic, there's been some incredible leaders that have stood up, and maybe I'm just looking at it from the company standpoint, but lots of businesses that are they're either manufacturing and they're pivoting to building PPE gear or plexiglass to go up it, and you've got other companies that are donating resources and things of that nature. Is there any do you think there's any traits that you're seeing or commonalities, with good leadership right now? Is there anything that comes to your mind that could be related to data or not? Like, what are you generally seeing?
Well, what we're seeing at least is that the more successful leaders are authentic in what they do, right? Mm-hmm. They walk the walk and they talk the talk, and that their organizations are agile and there's some sort of social good, right? Yeah. That they kind of mix all those things together. And when you roll up all those things, what you have is basically an opportunity for company leaders and companies to almost remake themselves because people are now paying attention to what a lot of large companies are doing, and it's a significant opportunity for those organizations.
Yeah. So maybe the last vertical, the last industry I'd like to touch on is real estate. I mean, this is and maybe we could talk about it on the consumer side, and maybe then on the corporate side. But I mean, for instance, the real estate markets in parts of Canada, Vancouver was quite strong, big bubble there. Toronto, big bubble there. Like, what do you think is going to happen with the housing market? Do you think things are going to remain what they were? Or do you think things are going to soften? What are your general thoughts there?
So, we talked about the Bloomberg tracking that we do, and one of them is on real estate. And to put this into context, back in 2008, when we had the recession in 2008, the one outlier from both a sentiment and a market perspective was real estate. Mm-hmm. That even when things looked really bad in 2008, real estate, the value of real estate, people's homes held, and people's perceptions on the future value of real estate remained positive. Fast forward to now, and for the first time in our tracking, there are more Canadians that think that real estate is going to go down than up. And this is especially true in the prairie provinces, which are also hit with a very low price of oil. And so I think real estate as a significant growth driver is not on. I think it's still going to retain value. But here's another question. We talked about making COVID proof. What about people's apartments that they live in, homes? This goes to your point. Now when people are going to be renting an apartment and buying a new home, they're going to be thinking, hey, if there's another pandemic and I got to work from home, is the work setup good here? Good? Is this good for me to have my family and kids here? If I need to look after my mom or dad, is this good for that? So think of, from a consumer perspective, now consumers looking at homes not just as places to sleep at night and to have dinner, but places that they might need to work out of in a multi-generational place, and that reshaping what builders and the construction industry has to do in order to meet those new demands and those new needs that we're going to see emerge out there.
Yeah, and I think in some of those, dense populations, like if you think about Toronto, for example, like you've got 300-400 square foot apartments, and you maybe might have 2 or 3 people working in there. I mean, it's a very, like, I don't know, it's an interesting, I think it's a precarious position for sure, and I'm curious to see how this evolves and whether that will change some of the philosophies and approaches with how we go about construction in the future. But the other one I'm really curious about is commercial real estate. Obviously, office buildings, et cetera. I know you spoke about that a lot of companies are potentially looking at downsizing and maybe reimagining what their work environment looks like. Do you have any general comments on where you see that market moving?
Well, we're probably we're going to just basically see that market, shrink in the in the longer term as companies save money. The ironic twist in all of this, Andrew, I don't know if you're a historian or a student of history, but you know what? In the Middle Ages, people worked from home, and just think, the people that owned the enterprises didn't have to pay to house to work people. We may be looking at a new emerging model where people technically are going to be paying rent on an apartment or paying mortgage in order to have the privilege of working from home, and their employers will not have to pay for the office space or the retail space for them to physically work in. And that's why I'm saying that we have to think of, there are going to be waves of change, and this is going to be basically another wave of change out there. And for developers, they're going to need to kind of accelerate this whole concept of office spaces and hubs as collision spaces of people, not warehouses of farm-like cubicles to have, thousands of people or hundreds of people, but as collision spaces that people go to convene, to have an experience, to interact with their teammates in order to create value and prosperity.
Yeah. And I know there has been a shift. I mean, in some of the markets like Calgary, where they've got 30% vacancy, and there's other markets where there's high vacancy, I know they've looked at converting lots of traditional office space into multi-use facilities, where you'll have your restaurant, your grocery store in there, you'll have condos in there, and then you'll have collaborative, open work concept space in there as well. So trying to keep everything in one vacuum of a structure. I think that's interesting. I think there'll be more of that. I think there'll be a lot more of that moving forward. I think, generally speaking, I am quite curious just to see how some of these industries approach the changes that are happening. I spoke with somebody not too long ago, and they sort of referenced that they felt that there are going to be brands that will be, really aggressive with how they tackle the change, and they're going to be, as much as they can, ahead of the curve. They're going to go really fast, and they're going to make decisions really quickly, and they're going to sort of decide where they want to be. And then there'll be brands that will wait for somebody else to pave the way and figure out if that's okay to do so, and maybe that works for them. Well, maybe it doesn't, I'm not sure. But I think there's a lot of businesses that are definitely considering pivots right now, and considering, how do they remain relevant. I've said it time and time again, but I look at, the restaurant industry, and I think, that's a business that inherently runs on really lean margins. And it's a business where, you've got to have, bums in seats to be able to be able to make money. And it's not just about the food product, it's then about the beverage, it's the tip, it's the experience. And then you go move it to a situation where you're only takeout or your curbside pickup, and you've got a couple of different apps to use to grow your marketplace, but they take a pretty substantial amount of your overhead there. So how does that work? And so you've seen some of these brands look at, okay, do I become a grocery store now? Do I sell my groceries direct, because there's going to be grocery stores with massive lineups and nobody wants to wait? Maybe I do a delivery service of groceries for people. I've also seen even some reputable restaurants that are doing Shopify sites now. There's a restaurant in Ottawa here that's got a wine delivery service, wine and charcuterie service through Shopify, where they're doing custom picked boxes of wines and Shopify, and they deliver it to your door. So,
but what Andrew, you're putting your finger on is the one common thread to all of this. Diversification will be a virtue, right? In the past, where enterprises said, we deliver an in-dining experience and nothing else, right? That's not going to work. But basically, what's going to happen and need to happen is that enterprises, for them to survive and adapt, will need to diversify and think of new ways to have revenue. So think of hotel, if we use the hotel industry as an example, there are a lot of sectors, a lot of players in the hotel industry that decided not to have a restaurant. Now, that might make sense, but then it just makes the hotel less diversified in terms of revenue streams.
Yes.
So, and to your example of those offices, those office towers in Calgary, that's basically a diversification of development space. So I think that's going to be the new virtue, where all enterprises from one end of the spectrum to the other, large and small, are going to be looking at how are they diversifying revenue, how do they become more agile to make sure that they are not hostage to one channel or one experience.
So I guess a final sort of closing question for you. What do you believe our role is, as people within this sort of, economy right now? What's our role in rebuilding the economy? How do we participate in that? Do you have any general comments, thoughts, insights there?
Well, our role is to listen and to give voice to customers, right? And to bring that kind of to be the connector between customers and those enterprises that are fighting out there in COVID. So I see that as our role, because for those, you talked about some of those companies that are just doing the same thing they did before. To me, that's indicative of, hey, you're not listening. And so the things that we can do is to listen to customers in order to bring that to the table and to give voice to them, and also to assist enterprises to be more agile, to ask those tough questions, to say, what, this might not just be a one-off occurrence, this might be a regular occurrence, and how are you restructuring your marketing, your message, and your brand in order to adapt and survive in this very fluid world.
So Nick, just as a closing sort of comment here, if people wanted to learn, if organizations want to learn more about how maybe their customers are changing their buying habits, maybe look at some of the service that your firm offers, how would they best reach you? What's the best way to get in touch with your operation?
Well, the good old telephone can work, cell phone, right? 613-276-2731. I still answer my phone. Email Nick, N-I-K, @nanos.co. But the fact of the matter is, because I travel a lot, I'd always say my office is my phone.
Yep.
And so we're pretty available.
Awesome. Well, Nick, thank you so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it, and look forward to connecting again with you soon.
That was great, Andrew.
Cheers. Thank you.
Cheers.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.